All right, we can start. Is that fine? All right, I will thank you everyone for attending this meeting. Thank you for being interested in human-centered design. And the purpose of today's meeting is to give you a little bit insight from professionals who have worked in this field, how human-centered design is applied. And since a lot of you are interested in human-centered design from an engineering perspective, I wanted our speakers to give their perspective, which is neo-artistics or engineering education perspective. And you will be able to interact with them, ask them questions, because you will notice that the majority of the solutions they will be presenting are engineering solutions. Although the design itself is a more human-centered design, but the solution, when implemented, it needs to be engineering solution. So the schedule of today is the following. We will start our presentation in 1 minute. We'll have 3 speakers. Tom Acker will be the first presenter, Aurelien Francois the second presenter, and Beebe will be the third presenter. After completing those presentations, we will be going on a tour on campus to visit the facilities we have. We have a large number of facilities that can be used for human-centered design, and the majority of us are not aware of the existing of this facility. And I want our students to see those facilities, because those facilities are for you and you are able to use them. You need the appropriate training to use some of the facilities, for example, in the MSEL, but the facilities are here for you, not only for us. So that's the second part of the schedule. The third part of the schedule, which will be a meeting over coffee, so you will be able to interact. We have some desserts and some coffee and tea. You will be able to interact with the HCED faculty, discuss with them, because probably the majority of you met them through Zoom, but they will be here and you will be able to talk with them, discuss a little bit more about HCED program, and enjoy the time, and this talk also with our speakers, and ask them questions about HCD and how do you envision being a HCD designer in the workspace. All right, so now to start, our first presenter is Tom Acker. Tom Acker is a good friend of mine, and I would like to thank him for accepting to speak to you today and provide and share his experience in human-centered design, and give you from his perspective how an engineer can contribute to the field of human-centered design. So Tom Acker is a UX designer, researcher, and instructor with over 8 years in digital business transformation and digital product development. Tom's passion is discovering unmet needs, so he builds things people love to use. Tom has done award-winning work with clients like WestJet, Canadian Tire, Four Seasons, Marriott International, Citibank, Longo, OP-PFC, and many others. Tom is dedicated to building up the next generation of user experience designer and researchers and teaches part-time at Juno College, in addition to working as an experienced lead at Fantasy. So we thank you, Tom, and the floor is for you.
Awesome. Thank you. Hello, everyone. So that was a great intro. So I won't spend a lot of time on my own intro, but I've been working in the field of UX design for quite a while now. And UX design is really kind of a subset of human-centered design that really focuses specifically on the user experience. And I work at a company called Fantasy. And we see ourselves as a human-centered design agency that primarily makes digital products. So what we mean by digital products is we kind of say, if a human interacts with it, we design for it. So we've done a lot of different types of projects here. You can see we've done a cruise ship app. We've worked on looking at the future of mobility. We've done things like mobile applications for electric cars. We've worked on operating systems in the past. We do things like online experiences, and we've even gotten a little bit more into autonomous driving and vehicle interfaces and what you would actually see within a vehicle when we use it. So you might be asking yourselves the questions. I'm not sure how many are familiar all are with human-centered design, but the question comes up a lot when I talk about this is, what is human-centered design? So it's one of those things that you can hear this buzzword over and over and over again, but you don't necessarily understand exactly what that means. And I didn't when I first started my career too. But what it boils down to, this quote from Jesse James Garrett, is human-centered design means understanding what your users need, how they think, and how they behave, and incorporating that understanding into every aspect of your process. And to me, ultimately, the way I distill this, or the way that I like to think about it, is it's all about designing things that just make sense to a user. When you put the user or a human at the center of your design process, you're going to end up with something that is inherently usable, and users just kind of get how it's supposed to work. So I have a couple basic examples to kind of explain how human-centered design is actually all around us in the things that we interact with every day. So one of the first examples I want to show you is this door handle. So I'm sure a lot of you have seen a door handle similar to this. And this is actually an example of a door handle that isn't designed using a human-centered design process. And the reason that is if you look and you try to actually use this door handle, there's nothing indicating to you to let you know which way you're supposed to push or pull the door. So there's no indication in terms of the writing on the handle itself, but also the way it's shaped. It isn't clear to you. It kind of looks like you could pull either way. And there's actually a couple of handles like this in my office. And I find myself every time I have to go back into the office wondering, okay, am I supposed to push or pull this door? And I'm sure a lot of you had a similar experience at some point in your lives where you've said, okay, you have that moment where you try to push and you find out it's a pull door, or you try and pull and it's a push door. And you kind of have that moment being like, why did someone design it this way? The alternative is a human-centered design approach to a handle. In this case would be having something like this, where you have, even if you didn't have the words on this handle here, you'd still be able to inherently understand how it works, because there is the ability to actually pull the door from that handle, and then the push is completely flat with the door. Adding that language obviously helps as well, but it's something that inherently just makes sense. When you look at this object, you understand how it's supposed to be used. And that is a human-centered design way of thinking about products, as opposed to that door I showed you before, which is maybe just a way of designing a product that doesn't take into account the way a person is actually going to use it or understand how to use it. Another really simple example of this is something you've probably all also had happen to you in the past if you cook at all, which is that this is a stove range. And here you can see, without having the diagrams with the knobs on the side, it's not immediately clear which knob is going to turn on which of the burners. So you probably have this example too, where you just turn on a couple of the burners trying to figure out, okay, which of these is the one that's going to correspond to the one that I actually need. And you've probably had the experience as well, where you have the pot on one of them, you go to turn on the burner and it's the wrong burner. So this is another example of not using human-centered design process to design a product. Whereas if you look at something like this type of range hood, the way the knobs are arranged on the hood, it's very similar to how the burners are laid out. So it's immediately clear to you as a user that the one on the top left will be the one on the top left, because it's laid out in the natural mapping of how we would think about the object itself. So this is an example of a human-centered design product, because we're thinking about how is a user actually going to interact with this? How is a human going to interact with this? And what's the natural mapping they have? So these are examples of obviously physical products, but this is true too for digital products. So things like pinch and zoom, where you want to get deeper into looking at whether it's a video or a photo, being able to zoom in, that's a very natural mapping to how a user would expect to do it. Needing to go onto the next screen of an app like TikTok, having that natural swipe motion where you understand if I want to go next, I swipe up. Same thing with things like long press. You want to get a lot more information, or you want to have a contextual menu, you long press on that icon or part of the screen, and you get that contextual menu coming up. So both in digital and physical products, human-centered design is really thinking about how is a human or a user that's coming to use this product, what are they naturally going to understand about how to use it, and how do we map our products to match the way that people actually do. But it's not only about designing things that make sense. That's just one part of human-centered design. It's also about designing things that solve a problem that nobody else is solving. And we call this an unmet need. An unmet need is basically an opportunity where we can identify something that isn't being answered by any other product that's out there and innovate so that we do something better than what's out there currently. And a great example of this is calling a taxi. So I don't know how many of you actually remember ever calling a taxi, but it used to have a lot of problems. So a lot of the issues with calling a taxi is you never knew when it was going to arrive. So you'd call the number and they would give you a range of 10 to 15 minutes. You didn't know who was actually going to ever show up. There was no feedback letting you know, if it really was coming. And if they did end up spending a lot more time than they said they were going to, they might still end up coming, but you had no way of knowing. You had no real way of knowing how much it was going to cost unless you lived in that area. You had no way of knowing if they were a good driver. And most of the time you had to have cash because they didn't have card readers. So there were a lot of problems with calling a taxi, but it was kind of the only option. And I'm sure you're all familiar with Uber, but what Uber really did was answer a lot of these unmet needs. So Uber is able to show you what time that you have until they arrive at the destination. You're able to track the car on a map so you can see if they're getting hung up somewhere or how far away they are actually from picking you up. You get an estimate before you order, so you know how much it's going to cost. There's a rating system, so you can understand if the user is or if the driver is proficient or not. And this is all done electronically, so you don't have to carry around cash or have exact change for the driver, and you can even tip them directly in the app. So ultimately, the reason that Uber has been so successful and is leapfrogging over the taxi industry is because it did a better job of understanding what people wanted from a service that gets them from A to B. So fundamentally, it is basically the same thing. You're getting in a vehicle, it's taking you somewhere else. But there were all these unmet needs surrounding the taxi experience that they were able to innovate on and solve better for the users. And by solving those problems better or answering those unmet needs better, they're able to get a bigger market share and ultimately be a better service. Now, there are a lot of other problems with Uber, but I'm talking about specifically just these unmet needs. So something I wanted to talk a little bit about too is what kind of things can you do with human-centered design? And really, ultimately, human-centered design is a practice, so it can be used to solve any problem. But the key is that you want to be able to put the people that are going to be using your service or product at the core. So what are their needs? What unmet needs are you answering better than anyone else? And so ultimately, you can build things like apps. So TikTok is a really great example of an app that solves the issue of discovery. So being able to find relevant and interesting content and getting it in a feed form so that you don't have to look for it or try to curate it yourself. Their algorithm shows you content that they find that they know you're going to find. There are things like websites. So this is 54Gene. So what they notice is the unmet need is that only 3% of the genome data that's out there for DNA testing is of people of African descent. There's a huge area. There's a huge gap in our scientific knowledge around people of African descent. So what they've done is they specialize in leading research on that and also providing services to people of African descent in order to get more insight into their background, history, and genetics. It can be things like services like Mogo, which exists in Detroit, where they realized that some people, they liked the idea of biking throughout the city as a way to commute. However, they didn't want to have the hassles of bike ownership and maintenance. So this service allows people to rent a bike for an hour for 30 minutes or less from point A to point B. They pick up the bike, drop the bike off somewhere else. So that's solving a real need for commuters. But what they also realized is it serves a huge need for tourists to a city because They want to be able to tour the city by bike, but they obviously aren't going to buy a bike for a 3-day trip. So it's a really great opportunity as well for the tourism within the city. You can do things like start businesses based on these ideas. So this is StockX, which is actually also based out of Detroit. Some of you might know it, but it's a startup that allows people to put streetwear, sneakers, but all limited edition things that are normally very difficult to find or source. And it created a marketplace for them online where they actually certify that these are authentic products, and they handle all of the shipping as well. So you just have to list it and they take care of kind of the rest of it. So noticing that opportunity in the market, that understanding that unmet need of people who want to get these very exclusive sneakers or streetwear that isn't normally available in a typical store, capitalizing that and building the whole business around it. There's also the opportunity in architecture. So this is by Bjarke Engels, who is an architect I believe this is in Norway. He was commissioned to basically design a power plant. But instead of just developing a power plant, he actually submitted a design that had a skiing slope on top of it. So it went from what could have been an eyesore within this community of a power plant to actually a multifunctional space, which allows people to enjoy it year round. And it's actually become an attraction in this part of Norway that people want to go see, as opposed to just being a generic power plant. So understanding, once again, the human unmet need of people wanting to have recreational space and playing on that even through architecture. And then finally, obviously, I've shown that example as well, but being able to build physical products as well that solve that need. Ring Doorbell being able to innovate on something as simple as a doorbell by adding in security features and helping it so you can see when someone's delivering a package to your house, or being able to remotely answer your door. These are all innovations that happen within the physical product space as well. So you might be asking yourself, this is cool, this is great, but how does it actually work? What does it look like to go through a human-centered design process? So we at Fantasy use something called the double diamond design process, and it basically consists of 4 main steps. And I'll walk you through one of my projects about how we kind of hit on each of these different areas throughout the process. So the first step that we have is something we call discover. And what this basically is doing is we're trying to identify a problem or a problem area and talk to as many people as possible to learn about it. And so when we talk about talking to people, we really like to get in there. So a key part of user experience design and human-centered design is obviously putting people at the core. So we start off by knowing we want to talk about a specific area and then just interviewing people about it. So in this case, we were working on for a grocery store chain in Toronto, and they knew they wanted to get a younger, more urban demographic, and they wanted to understand how they could capture more of that downtown audience who was a little bit more strapped for time, probably in a younger age group. By younger, I mean like under 35, who weren't cooking at home as much and were using a lot more things like Uber Eats. So we talked to a lot of people within Toronto that were doing that, that were either a heavy user of Uber Eats, or they just didn't do a lot of their own grocery shopping to kind of understand what their problems were and why that wasn't happening. So this included talking to at least 16 different people, interviewing them, asking about their habits, asking about how they shopped. And we even went on a couple of shop-alongs where we would go with them to the grocery store and they would talk to us about why they were selecting certain products or why they weren't selecting other products. And what this allowed us to do is start to understand our users and why they're making choices that they're making. The next step we look at is defining. So figuring out what parts of the problem you'd like to solve. And so what we basically do is we take all that data we learned from all these different people and we put it onto a big whiteboard, and we try to understand what are the themes that come out of this and what are the potential areas we could look at. So in this case, the thing that we were looking at the most is for time strap, younger people, in this case it would be millennial, starting to be a little bit of Gen Z, what is their biggest overarching kind of theme? And what we learned about these types of people is the biggest problem they had wasn't necessarily that they didn't want to cook at home, it's that they didn't know how to cook, or they didn't understand what they could cook. So they would go to the grocery store. It seemed like a whole extra effort for them to try and come up with ideas for meals. Many of them had never cooked before, or was their first time having to cook on their own. And so instead of actually figuring out these recipes beforehand or trying to figure this stuff out, they would just default to going to Uber Eats, or they would just get something ready-made, but they didn't have the ability to kind of make these fresh meals. So we knew kind of what the space we wanted to come up with the solution for, and then it became time for us to actually develop a bunch of ideas. And so at this phase, what we try to do is come up with as many ideas as possible that can solve the problem and test which one is going to work best. So this is my team. We use a lot of sticky notes when we're brainstorming. We try and get like a big room and basically just put up as many ideas as possible on the board. So at this point, we develop between 16 to 20 different potential solutions. And that doesn't mean just digital products. So sometimes it will be an app, or it'll be a feature of a website, but that could also be a hybrid between a digital product and a physical space. And so that's ultimately what we came up with. We came up with this idea that we had where we called Meals Made Easy. And essentially what it would be is a kiosk within the grocery store that would change once a week. And you would always have 3 or 4 different options of meals that you can make. We provide a recipe card as well as an iPad where you could choose how many different people you were going to be cooking for that week, and all the ingredients you needed to make that meal would be right there. And the key to this was, one, to give you meal ideas so that you could easily make them, and also make it really easy for you to just go in, grab what you need, and leave, for people who didn't have a lot of time to plan a meal. So trying to take away that whole cognitive load of coming up with a meal idea. So this is some user testing we did. So we build prototypes all the time. So we actually built a kind of a fake grocery store kiosk in our office with cardboard. And this is just some monitors we had that we were able to hook up. And we tested it with users. So we did a couple rounds of testing with this, figuring out what does the interface look like on the iPad, what kind of information do you need to have on the screen? And ultimately, we took that information to refine the concept more. And then it comes to the deliver. So this is where we choose our one most promising idea or multiple promising ideas and actually build it in the store, or launch it as an app. And so this is the Meals Made Easy kiosk that is live right now in Toronto. You can go and see that, and they piloted it in a store downtown, and then it's now spread to a couple other stores as well. And it's been ultimately really successful. So we started with just talking to people. We came up with some ideas. We made a prototype, and then we actually launched it into the wild. So I just wanted to go quickly over some things that I've made and like what types of projects you can do with human-centered design. So we've done things like a travel app where we helped make the all-inclusive vacation experience a lot easier for users. This included things like being able to check in by the pool instead of having to wait at the front desk, being able to use your phone to open up your room so you don't have to necessarily get a room key, waiting in a line again for the front desk, and automating things like scheduling excursions so that you can book activities from the comfort of your hotel room or by the side of the pool. I've also worked on, So I've also worked on the Smithsonian as well, the African American History Museum, which was a really cool opportunity where we were able to digitize some of their exhibits. And then I've also worked with a sporting goods retailer where we were able to actually kind of renovate the entirety of their store and think of it from a human-centered design point of view, where users would enter and the whole store was set up around finding your next activity that you wanted to be a part of. So building it around, I'm able to run, so I want to get better at running. How do you level me up in running? Or how do I find my next thing that I'm excited about? So the last thing I wanted to talk about before we go to questions is, who do I think is a good fit to be a human-centered designer? So these are some of the things that I found in my career are really useful for people who want to get into this field and who excels the best. So I think people who are naturally curious, so if you're the type of person who's always asking questions, always trying to figure out how does this work, or why does this service work this way, I think that's a really great attribute to have if you're going to human-centered design, because that's going to be a lot of what you do, is just understanding why do people act the way they do, what are their motivations, and how do we design around that. If you're always looking for a better way, so how do we do this better? How do I make this, improve this process? That's another key hallmark of the work that you'd be doing. Being comfortable with ambiguity is really key, because there's going to be a lot of times you don't know exactly what you're doing. You're kind of, you understand what users, maybe a user or someone you're designing for, what they need, but you're going to have to come up with some ideas, and some of those ideas aren't going to work. So being okay with the fact that some things aren't going to work sometimes, and that you're going to test and iterate and keep going, and that you won't always know the next step, but you're still moving forward. So being comfortable with ambiguity is definitely a big part of it. And then finally, this is personally, you know, being obsessed with trying new things, especially working at an agency where we work with a lot of different clients. I get to work on lots of different types of projects. And I'm the type of person where if I'm not working on something new every, 6 to 9 months, I start to get a little bit itchy. So if that sounds like you, if you can't sit still, if you're always trying to find something new, then I think that this is a really also great career path, because you're always going to be on your toes yeah, interested. So that is my presentation, and I'll open it up for any questions from you.
Thank you very much. All right, it's time for questions. We have some time for questions. Do you have any questions for Tom? Go ahead, please.
When you get a project from a potential client, is it an open-ended time frame, or do they have like a goal set for you that you have to work to?
Yeah, so there are two types of projects usually we work on. One is a more open-ended, what we would call like a vision or future of project. So sometimes we'll get a brief that's as broad as, this is what we worked on with the all-inclusive vacations client. They basically said to us, look, we want to know what the future of vacations are going to be, or all like package vacations. What is the future of package vacations? And that's what they hire us for. And usually it's like 3 to 4 months, and it's a lot of first-party research where we're going out interviewing people. We even went to the airport actually to interview people who are going on vacation. We've interviewed some of the front staff. So those types of projects are more open-ended. There's always a bit of like, we'll always give them a timeline of when we can deliver, what we think the vision is going to be. And that'll be a whole bunch of concepts that we've tested with people that we think these are, 8 or 9 different projects you could go forward with that we think would make a really big impact to your business. We also have projects where they kind of have a better idea of what they're looking for. So if they're saying, we know we need an app for the traveler, and we want you to build that app, then usually that'll have even more of like a tight timeline of how long that's going to take us to develop. So sometimes it's broad. I think the broad ones are more fun, to be honest, more interesting, because we get to uncover a lot more interesting unmet needs about people. But regardless, the process still kind of is the same either way.
So
Yeah.
when you're starting a new project or working with a new client, how long does each step take? So like when you're first starting and it's a new field you haven't worked on before, how long does that first initial step take to get to be familiar with the industry you're working in or the problem you've got?
Yeah, so normally I would say it depends on how much experience the team has in it. I would say the shortest possible would be a month, but it can be anywhere from 1 month to probably 2 months is the longest it would be. And in the process of that, what we're doing is we're looking at market research. So we're saying, what are the trends within your industry? What are your competitors doing? So who are the major players? How much market share do they have? What does their business model look like? And then basically that will give us our competitive advantage. So what sets us apart from these other competitors, or what could potentially set us apart from a design perspective. And then we're doing a lot of that user research as well. So that's where we're getting a lot of that's where the human-centered insight comes from. And so I would say the majority of the time is spent interviewing, We also interview the internal stakeholders of the company. So we'll interview like the VP of marketing, we'll interview the customer care representative, actually talk on the phone to understand what are your common complaints from your users or your customers. And so it's really all about that immersion and trying to understand from every perspective, from the people who are working the front lines to the people who are setting the strategy for the company to the market and the competitors, as well as that main focus on the people who are going to ultimately use the service or product.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Have you had any experiences where a client engages you for some human problem they think they've identified, and then in your discovery you find like a much more interesting or compelling or like actual problem, and then have to come back and say like, hey, you might want to redefine completely what you're trying to do here? And then if so, like what does that conversation look like, and how do you help clients to understand better the problem that they think they know about?
Yeah, I would say that happens about 80% of the time. And that is kind of why they're engaging you. So a lot of the times our clients know they don't have it solved, and they're engaging us and they're saying, we want to do something around this area. Sometimes they're really confident and they say, hey, we know this is happening. The great part is when you are starting from a human-centered design perspective, the fact that you've interviewed 16 people and you have direct quotes, and you can say, 10 out of the 16 people we talked about said this was their biggest problem, and you don't even have that on your radar right now. So we really have these ideas, or we think this project should really address this instead. And usually at that point, it's a pretty easy sell for them, because they say, oh man, we had no idea. And that aha moment for our clients is also a reason they want to work with us, is because a lot of them have never actually thought of designing products in this way. I know it sounds, and this is what's interesting about human-centered design, it seems pretty intuitive as a process, but it's actually not something that is very well established within most industries. So the idea that you would be listening to you would actually be asking your customers what their motivations are, what they want, what they need from a service, is still kind of a relatively new thought in the last 15 years. So a lot of organizations will come up with ideas, put them into market, and they've never really done a lot of testing to figure out if they're actually solving a problem somebody needs to be solved in their life.
All right, I have a question.
So the composition of your project teams, is it more like each individual person specializes in a certain area, or is it like each person has, a wide variety of tools they add to the team? Yeah, so because we work in digital product, we usually have a user researcher. So I'm a user designer, but UX designer, and I started in user research. So I do both. But you usually have someone who's trained specifically in research. You'll have sometimes a business strategist. So that's somebody who specializes in that market assessment I was talking about before, who's really good with numbers and spreadsheets and figuring out market share. And then you have me, who's like a user experience designer. So I kind of work between both of them, and I generate the ideas and ultimately design the products in the end. Have visual design people who are specifically looking at the aesthetics of the experience. And then we'll have usually a producer who's responsible for making sure everyone's getting their stuff in, double checking with the client, making sure the client's on board, preparing us for presentations and all that kind of stuff as well. So everyone kind of has their own individual role, but when it comes to generating ideas or the ultimate strategy, we all get in a room together and we all bring our unique perspectives to come up with those solutions together. And then we all kind of have a different role in what we deliver. And I think it's the strongest when everyone plays a little, like, to be a specialist and an expert in your specific field, but to be always playing a little bit of all the different roles and being whatever the team needs you at a different time, because ultimately you're kind of delivering this thing together.
Thank you very much. I think we should catch up on our schedule. Let's give another round of applause to Tom. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
I appreciate sharing your experience with us, with the students, and hopefully we can talk more about it in future events. Thank you, Tom.
Good. Thank you.
Right. So I would like to welcome our next speaker, who's Aurelien Francois. He likes to be called Aurel. Aurel Francois is a senior industrial designer at Faurecia. Faurecia is a French company that they have their offices here in Michigan, a global leader on automotive seatings, interior design, onboard experience, and emission control technologies. Since he joined Faurecia North America Design Studio in 2016, Aurel has been thriving through cross-functional collaboration, contributing human-focused industrial design insight to process and product development. Earlier in his career, Aurel worked for 7 years at the local motors, supporting the creation, development, and production of innovative vehicles using online creation and local micro manufacturing. Aurel holds a bachelor's degree in science in design and engineering management from the Institut Supérieur de Design in France. And this is in northern France. I never met Aurelien before coming to Michigan, although we were in northern France at the same time. So I will help Aurelien set his thing, and we will be ready to present. So do you prefer?
What a good place to have the laptop.
You need to hook up your.
I just need HDMI.
Okay.
Like HDMI.
All right. So that's why you don't have one.
Yeah, there's a laptop.
Oh, very good.
Yeah.
This one.
Yeah. So.
This is the one you need. Yeah, that's the one. Okay, thank you. Stop this if we switch. Okay. Are you ready? Yep. Do you need a printer?
I have one.
People won't get it. Oh, they will not be able to see it, but they will be able to see it from the camera. And I have a question. Can you email this presentation to me, and we can
Right now?
Yeah.
That may be difficult.
Okay, that's fine.
Be precise and.
That's fine. We'll go for it.
Maybe one solution would be using Zoom from his laptop.
To not work. Okay.
Is it working?
So you will share it or not? That's okay. Good. Good. It's not working. You have any other connections than HDMI? Would you like to try the other one?
I have other adapters.
This one. I think you have it here. Yeah. Okay, here we go. Perfect.
You could check the online course.
Okay, I will check with
Just to
all
make
my
sure
calls.
they can
So-
see both our speaker and the slide.
What I'll be doing is I will force the app to.
I'm also going to check here.
So, Lauren, are you able to see the screen? Jackie, you hear me?
Yes, we can see the screen.
Paul?
Yep. I mean, kind of, it's not sharing in the Zoom, but we can see the screen through the camera.
And I know it's recording. Okay, I think we can go ahead. Yeah,
We're good?
yeah, please go ahead.
I didn't bring the internet.
No, no, you're fine, go for it.
All right. George, you think it's possible to dim the light a bit? Or
Yeah, let's see.
that would be great.
Yeah, it did.
Yeah.
All right. Sounds good.
Go for it.
So thank you very much for the invitation for today, and thank you very much for attending the presentation. George told me there was like this opportunity to talk about like user-centered design, and that's one of the activity processes that we use at Forcia. So today we'll be like navigating through complexity of like serving the user and at the same time taking into account context. So first thing, like very quickly, who is Forcia? Forcia is a component supplier. We are a global supplier in the automotive field. And like number to remember is like 1 in 3 cars in the world has like one of our component around. So it's fairly large company. And we have like 4 main activities. One is seating, one is inter-systems, another one electronics, and the 4th one is emission controls or clean mobility. When I joined the company in 2016, I got through a lot of different like terms, lingo, certain things were buzzwords, certain things were super interesting. I love like bulleted lists because they make me feel smarter. I feel that I understand everything. But truly they can be super confusing because meeting after meeting after meeting, I was learning new things.
I was checking if it's working.
So it was making things challenging because like I was learning so many new things, but it was very hard to get them to work together. What you can see like in some of the words that are highlighted here, we have 4 words. One of them is like connected, another one is autonomous, the 3rd one is shared, and the 4th one is electric. So 4 mega trends with which I've been working for the past few years since I joined the company. Context 2021. COVID has been around for close to 2 years. We are going through a microchip shortage that is hurting the economy at this point. And obviously like global warming and climate change are real concern, particularly considering like what happened over the past year in terms of like weather conditions. Our 4 mega trends that were so central, like autonomous driving is taking much longer than expected because it's a super hard problem to tackle. Microchip shortage is like hitting like autonomous and connected, and COVID has been very rough on shared mobility. So like 4 things that were taken for granted are now very hard to comprehend if we don't map and understand the overall context. What I do when I feel confused about things like that, I do what a good designer do in that context. I procrastinate and I go on the internet looking for memes and like inspirational quotes. The one to the left is nice because it mocks the designer and it celebrates the user. The one to the right is the exact opposite. It celebrates the designer or the creator and mocks the user because, you know, who is the user? They don't really know what they want. Like both Steve Jobs and Henry Ford went through success and failure. Something important to understand about Henry Ford, for example, like, you know, Ford Model T, early 20th century, late 19th century, like in the US, you had like 1 horse for every 4 people in the US. 1/3 of crop area, crop land was used to feed those horses. New York City alone, 150,000 horses on the streets, 40 of them dying daily and stay on the street for a little while. That was about 3.3 million pounds of horse manure that was on the street daily, 39,000 gallons of urine. So there was a context that also explained why at some point people made the choice of going for cars rather than horses. Today we have issues with cars just like they had issues with horses back then. In user-centered design approach, like one of the tools we use is that Venn diagram. You've probably seen it before. So desirable, viable, feasible. If you meet all 3 criteria, then you may be able to have like an interesting solution to explore. Taken from a different perspective, it's business, user, technology that work together. The automotive industry, like on the business end, it's very simple. Like today, there is no more bad car like it used to. You know, when you go rent a car, like what do you get? You get a car that will have like CarPlay, or you get a car that will have like Android Auto or something like that. You know, you want those features. You're not worrying about a car that will be used stranded on the side of the road. The technology part is like two-sided. Like one is serving the user, so you know, giving more good experience to the user, the service, you know, taking away some effort, some pain, some frustration, some boredom. The other side is good for the business because that gets the business to know more about the user, you know, target better what the user might want through the life of the product during the development. And some businesses even like use those data as the main asset that they have, like the main product in some ways. So, you know, think about Uber, service to the user and data to the company itself. The user part though is something very complex, and I like to go through that one like more in depth. We all know that that line, you know, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Declaration of Independence, 1776. We've been enjoying more or less the same fundamental freedoms as our grandparents have over generations. But the means that we have to exercise these freedoms have considerably increased. What you see here, the graphic part, is actually like energy use. Like that corner here, oops, sorry. That corner here, bottom left corner, is like 1800. So about 25 years after Declaration of Independence. That's energy use. So mostly biomass, conventional biomass at the bottom. Then you get through coal. Then you get through oil. Then you get through natural gas, nuclear power, and then hydroelectric and renewable at the top. So since 1800, population of the world increased by less than 8-fold. Energy consumption increased by 30-fold. So it's a massive increase just to be able to reach that happiness. So hopefully we get like 30 times the amount of happiness. But if ever we drop and we don't have that energy anymore, or we slow down, that will get very difficult. So that's, I wanted to bring that because on one hand, we have like boundless freedom and wish to experiment things. On the other hand, we have finite resources that we are hitting the limit at this point, and we cannot keep increasing in such a way. There are three ways to address the issue when you have this kind of conflict. Either the resource is no longer available and the resource becomes too expensive and people can't use it, it hurts. Or you go through regulation. I read California just announced they will ban small internal combustion engines on lawnmowers and leaf blowers, for example. Or you have an approach from designing the product, try to better understand, narrow down to what people want, and maybe implement a little bit of less is more approach, but offering something that is different to people and not necessarily the downgrade from what they are used to. From that point that I was trying to map, I started working on a way to create a matrix, a visual that will help me do a mind mapping and get me to understand all the different concepts I was dealing with. So that diagram is for one part is everything that is human related. Everything I can learn about humans is on that side. Then everything that is on the right side, first part is about the machine, the car that we're making with all the components. Car and user make the system, and the system in itself evolve in an ecosystem. So I was trying to map all of that, also to be able to agree with my coworkers on terms, HMI, for example, means thousands of things depending on who you talk to, and also be able to map certain concepts I wanted to develop. So human, who are we talking with the human? User-centered design, human-centered design. What is the nuance? Human is everyone who has a connection with the product. So what you will see, I keep using the wrong thing, okay. So that side, you have engineer, designer looking at the rest of the people, assembly line worker. Assembly line worker will repeat the same motion again and again and again. They will produce thousands of parts. If it's straining, difficult to create stress for them, eventually that will hurt them, which is very bad. They may leave the job, we need someone else, or they will, make the product not at the best quality. And so the client in the end, so the manufacturers for us, will not be happy. The end user will have a product that is not lasting through time. So we have to think about that assembly worker as much as we have to think about the end user. Similarly, more and more, we have to think about the full life cycle of the product. So that will mean recycling needs that we have in the end. So we are thinking more mono-material, mono-component when we are developing something new. For today and through that diagram, it's easier for me to just focus on the user, the people who are either passenger, driver, buyer of the vehicle, Uber rider, people who will be in there and experience it firsthand. And already there, we have a wide diversity of people going through that. Next aspect is, we said, these people are very diverse. What are the traits? Where do they come from? What's their life? What's their mood of the moment? You can be the same person, but if you're hungry or not, you may react in very different way. So as much as we can know about the user or the group of users, try to find everything they have in common that can help us get to the best solution. Then next stage is needs. I use Maslow's hierarchy of needs as a reference. There are other models that exist, but at least that's a common ground that I can have with people to assess whether certain needs are more urgent than other ones. If you're using your car to escape danger because there is a fire, or if you're commuting, or if you're just cruising while on vacation, you may have different needs for the AC to be reliable or not. So that has to be taken into account in the context of the user interacting with the vehicle we have. Next layer is everything that is about cognition, about the user, about what's happening in the head, the ability to process information, analyze context, reason. So you can learn a lot of things through looking into different fields social and human sciences, evolutionary psychology, neuroscience, everything you can find can be interesting. Those are 4 references from a website that is called Laws of UX that I absolutely love. They have different rules or recommendations that they have around the topic of user experience. And those four, for example, is Doherty threshold. So this one is about the seamless experience. If there is lag, it's painful and the user is losing track of what's going on. Fits law is about like the time it takes to acquire target depending on the distance. If I'm trying to get like to the table here, it's very easy. I can get the little blue spot. If I'm trying to get like all the way to the fire alarm here, it takes me longer to acquire. Sounds very logical, but it has to be established as a rule. So we tend to be more careful about where we put controls in the vehicle. Hicks law is about the time it takes to make a decision. If you have more diversity of choices, it's more complex to make a decision. There is overload. And the fourth one, you may be creating the most incredible thing in theory, but if the user is used to navigate Facebook, Instagram, whatever, if you come with something that is completely new in terms of interface, like the user will not like your product just right away. So you have to take that into account. How does it look like in practice? This is an interface that we created at 4CR. It's called Trenza. And so Trenza has more or less like a defined space that you have. It's just a display. But you can easily reorganize, put the right amount of content depending on what you want at a given moment. You need more GPS space and see less about the radio. You get just the right amount of information. It's seamless. It's using references in terms of HMI, in terms of graphic user interface that are common to other navigation systems. And it's at arm's reach. So that's very easy to use. Talking about HMI, I was talking about that just a minute ago. So HMI is human-machine interface. Unfortunately, due to history, people tend to think that HMI is only like the display and a keyboard or a mouse. A lot of people think that way, but like the human and the machine can have a lot more channels to communicate with each other. So let's look at all the channels, all the input that a human can receive. We have all 5 senses that we all know, but you have like many more senses that are not as known. You know, like you have like pronoception, that is perception of time. You have the nociception, that is like perception of pain. And like the list goes on. As much as you can get those channels and be able to match them with the machine equivalent, you have one new channel of communication with the user. Same goes with the output from the user. You hear my voice, you see my facial expression, at least for the top half. You get all this information, you know, that's my output. So those are active output. As passive output, you could be tracking my heart rate. You could see like the skin condition, whether I'm feeling cold or I'm scared. You could track my gamma waves out of the brain to know whether I'm having like good sleep or bad sleep. So all those passive active are just output things. This makes the HMI from the point of view of the human, which then is matched with the machine in itself. Like you have actuators, speakers, gauges, like all the things give information that the machine output becomes the input to the user. To the opposite side, you have like sensor, microphone, and switch that get information. When you push on the pedal, that's your pressure output, and that becomes the input of the machine. Information is transferred, the vehicle moves forward and accelerates. In cars, unfortunately, fortunately, we don't have only that relationship. We also have like filters that could distract. Like we could be talking with someone else. We have our smartphones. We could be smoking a cigarette, and the cigarette butt is just falling on us, and we're afraid that we're about to catch on fire. So we are distracted from the main activity of driving. So we have to take into account that we also have this other input, other output that are in the same space. So here we've seen we moved from the human to the machine. We have that transition. We have where we put the different solution, the mapping. So in that case, in the interior of the car, we have like 6 main areas that are located here that are typically assemblies that we make for our customers. Center console, door panel, instrument panel, or dashboard. We have like the greenhouse, which is all the upper part of the car, and then we have the floor. Why does it matter? Take the case of autonomous driving. Imagine in the future, you don't have to control the vehicle the same way anymore. You can have like long tracks and go away from the instrument panel. You can relax, so more recline angle. That's very cool, except that it brings more complexity. All your controls have to be relocated from the instrument panel to your seat because you're too far away to control anything. As your seat is reclining even more now, you cannot have your safety belt that is attached to the B pillar of the car because you move too much and you have too much angle. So the safety belt now is attached to the seat. That means you have to reinforce all the structures of the seat. So that's the reason why it's very important to not only come with a solution, but be able to localize that solution and understand all the impact that comes down from that decision. Next, and this is probably more of your field from what you're learning here, is like the logical and reasoning skill of the machine. And this part is everything that we have in terms of AI, cybernetics, like all these fields, like bring good insight. We have technological development, and what the machine is able to do tends to be like very complementary to the human. You know, the human will have like more of a top-down approach of like looking at big picture and narrow down to all the different pieces and analyze down to like the small bits. The machine will tend to do the other way around of getting like a lot of data, but like looking each and every single information to be able to draw the big picture. So there's some complementarity in there, and there's like definitely like a lot of evolution that is happening nowadays. But this is that layer of machine intelligence in some ways. Then we have the distribution of the function on the outer skin of the vehicle. It's not our field of activity, so I didn't go too much into that, but it exists and it supports some of our innovation in the end, like we will see. All of those things form the system. So the system is the human in the vehicle itself, so the machine and everything that is included in there, things or people. All those things interact then with the outside. So we've always seen like human input, other input, and same for the outputs. All those things interact with the outside. So very simple situation. Someone is at the red light. You are the red light, and there is like a old lady or an old man that is like taking like forever to cross the street. Like you honk at that person. Technically, you're the one honking, but like the noise comes from the vehicle. You could have been like, excuse my French, flipping the bird, and like you get that old lady very mad at you. If that old lady has an umbrella, she may hit the hood if you're driving a truck. If ever you're driving a roadster, she will probably go to you and hit you on the head. If I'm the passenger of the car and I'm the closest to the old lady, she will hit me. So this, you get like the input-output thing. We are a whole system, and the old lady is one system of our own with input-output channels. And I may be hit, you may be hit, the car may be hit. We are one system and perceived as such. When we have that level, like we are only dealing with other systems that typically are complex enough to have capability of input and output, which means like, you know, road signs are able to tell you an information, but at the same time are tracking which speed you're going. Law enforcement are doing the same thing. Pedestrian can interact with you, other vehicles are systems on their own. So how does it look in practice? Like, so this is another like driving assistance product that we have. So in practice, like it's understanding the environment. That means like having more sensors on the outside of the vehicle, having like e-mirrors, like cameras that record and be able to get the information and analyze that information, treat the data if there is fog, so you see better what's in your rearview mirror. Or in the case of here going in an underground garage, there are like parking time spots, partially in Europe or usually like going to Europe. Sometimes you park and like you don't have access to what's happening in the back of the car if you need to access your cargo. So here, for example, we see like the car knows that there won't be any way to access what's behind. So then like taking into account some of the vehicle intelligence, the knowledge, understanding of what's happening around the vehicle, the user can go outside, get its content, and then be able to go out of the vehicle and vehicle park itself. So that is taking into account like 3-4 layers of diagram I showed you. Finally, like the last layer is the context of that ecosystem. So it's like the big picture. It's like the 4 mega trends I introduced earlier. It's like COVID, like all of a sudden the world changes and well, it's pushed from the top, like we all have to adjust. that will be like climate change that is changing the way we live and act. So that structure is called like sprite structures used in social science. And so there may be like other fields, other ways to organize, but it's kind of a common way to approach it. So for us, what does it look like human-centered design when we get to that scale? That is like committing to reducing like CO2 emissions. So like, for example, we're partnering with a steel maker. Steel is like between 7 and 9% of CO2 emissions in the world at this point. So like, it's very heavy. And there is like that new technology, new solution, but it's quite long to implement because it's heavy industry that is using hydrogen in the process. So the output is not CO2 anymore, but water. But obviously you need to get the hydrogen, so you need to produce hydrogen using like renewable energies. So we have a partner in Scandinavia that is doing that, partnering with other like, energy suppliers and like working together to be able to have that low CO2 emission still to be able to curb those emissions. So we have a partnership with that company and we will start using their steel like starting 2026. So that was an overview of like that tool that ended up like structuring my mind and be able to work on the different projects and have a better understanding of the things I deal with and all the different concepts. As main key takeaways, do these 6 things. So empathize, define, ideate, prototype, test, implement. That's part of the design thinking process. It's very similar to what Tom was introducing earlier, which was there was the discover, define, develop, and is it deploy or no?
Deliver.
Deliver is always very important. So like, go through the step and actually doing things is better than just saying in theory, because like in theory, everything works. But in practice, it's a little more complicated. Be curious and collaborate. It's likely that you're missing some insight that may come from a different field. So be open-minded, collaborate with people. No solution will ever be perfect. We've seen it. Cars were a solution to horses. Nowadays, they are like a big problem. So like, you have to accept that nothing will ever be perfect. Human-centered design belongs to all willing to put the effort. So it takes some effort, but it doesn't belong to the people who always have something to sell you. If a product is creating a problem, it's not necessarily me selling you another product or service to fix that first issue. That is a good solution. The good solution may be to get rid of that first product in the first place. So people who have to sell you something, always take that with little distance and just try to assess for yourself the overall context from human to context. More important thing is like the user will have probably like loss aversion or complaint bias, which means like for anyone, it's very hard to downgrade to something. If you've been used to like a big truck, it's very hard all of a sudden to tell you to drive a Toyota Prius. So you have to understand those people, because if you have like a great idea that is not accepted by people, then your great idea is just like without shoes. So always keep that in mind, that you have to, at the same time, take care of the context, take care of the user. That's very complex, but that's the only way that we can make things better. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So, I mean, it's time for discussion. We have one question. I have also a few questions for you, and that will. I thought some of the students are hesitant of asking, but we'll get to that. Please go ahead.
Thank you for this. This was great. I thought that the way you presented the user contextualized all the way out to the environment room was really interesting. I was listening to Bruce Mao recently as a designer give a talk about something, and he started describing what he calls life-centered design. It's like he feels like that's the next step from human-centered design to life-centered, taking into account all this other stuff. And in the empathy step, we now talk to customers and observe customers, like humans who use these products. What are you doing to do that analogous activity, but for the environment they're in, to make sure that we're also solving for the unidentified or other kind of issues we create with our products potentially? you know, it's like the non-human problems, but still problems that are out there. Does that make sense?
Can you give an example?
So we might create a technology that solves a human problem, right? But one of the effects would be that we create, well, like for instance, we brought up a lot of the historically how we generate energy, burning coal, solves a lot of human problems, creates a lot of environmental problems. So how do we empathize? How do we, in our empathy activity, include not just people, but those externalities? Try to have a more comprehensive problem that takes that into account.
Well, it's the whole difficulty of this, like, you know, awareness is already like one plus point, like if you're trying to satisfy like one customer, one person, but it hurts all the people around, that's an issue. You know, like, just let's take like for somebody in the US, like we have like very large distances to cover when you're traveling. And like the way things evolve, like you take like General Motors, Ford, like they all have like many different brands, and you are growing through your life, starting with a Chevy, all the way if you know, if you were successful in life, you ended up like with a Cadillac once you made it. So you could be all the way, but those cars were made with the same bolts and nuts, often engines, and you were getting that upgrade to like a bit more chrome, you know, a bigger car and like more things, more stuff, better quality leather. Like in Europe, the choice has never been made to make like cars bigger because like the environment is not a lot of things, like they have environmental constraints that so a much bigger car was never a luxury up to some point. So that probably is one of the things that we have to consider is like those users, like what are the things that will constrain their experience and what we can offer them. But that's where context enters in that vision. Does that answer the question?
I think so.
So correct me if I'm wrong. Clarion, is it that Garcia has?
Clarion, yeah.
Clarion. Is that for a fully touchscreen interface?
So, so the Transa interface that I showed you?
Correct. Because my question is there any research to indicate that a touchscreen interface would be better to use than, you know, say physical buttons or anything like that for a new user onboarding?
So that's a big topic at this point. There is, let's say we have like 3 layers. Like we are like suppliers. We have like our clients, like, you know, like all the General Motors, Ford, Tesla, and others. And then we have the end user. There's always that fear of like missing the boat, you know, like missing like the train, like everybody like, oh, touchscreens, like Tesla in the future, everybody wants to put like the biggest touchscreen that they can find and put that in there. Well, we'll deal with client. If our client is saying like the end user actually want to have like the largest display possible, then go for it. But like a few years back, there's been like backlash because Honda had put like, you know, a full display and had removed like knobs, you know, like the volume control and only put a slider. People, you know, you're driving, you know, we drive at night, we know our cars and like, we're just like, okay, this is the heat, this is the fan speed, and like you adjust that way. I do that. I will not want a car that has like a full like display. That being said, my boss has a Tesla and like he absolutely loves the display thing. So I do prefer the physical myself, but I need to experience more the display. But yeah, it's happening. I don't think we'll get to a point that the display is the one and only thing. And I also believe that on the long run, people will get tired of those like big black glossy surface area that show all the fingerprints and look terrible, like except in commercials, otherwise it's bad.
All right. I mean, there will be a last question. I would like to ask the question. So, in the steps for design, not only you, but Tom also mentioned the last step is implementation. But in reality, this is not the last step. The end of life of a product is not the implementation. This is the beginning of its life. And the next step will be iteration, the updates, correct? And this is not, haven't been mentioned, like there are always some biases in the product we create because those biases are associated with whoever we created the product for, and we will be discovered that once it's implemented, correct? And this is something we should not forget, that the product should be always evolving to adapt to the life, the expectancy from the what the users expect from the product. And the question is, the majority of the products we are talking about are design products, but they are engineered. Someone needs to write the code, someone needs to create the product if it is a physical product. And you are an industrial designer. What about your interaction with engineer? What do you think about engineers being designer in the same time? And this is what the degree that we are offering. It's not industrial, not engineering, but an engineer that can be a designer in the same time.
So in terms of flexibility, like that's the one issue with like heavy industry in which we are. Like if we tell the release engineer, oh, by the way, like we have to interact, like 2 weeks after like launching production because we made a mistake, like that will be millions and millions of like retooling and like waiting for the production and all that. So we have to take into account, in the life cycle, more or less when the new car starts, we already know that there will be like a mid-model refresh, and then the end of the product and like another one will replace. That's the hardware part, and the hardware is like always having that issue of like not being easy, not very flexible, because there is so much capital expenditure, CapEx that goes into it. Now, software, we have more and more software, and yeah, that's something that is like more and more possible, like being able to update some software remotely, giving the user the sense that, wow, this car is 2 years old, but he just got this whole new upgrade, and then we're able to improve and get a new experience. If I make this graceful signal just on the chip shortage, because like I think this is related to what we're discussing. In the automotive industry, like we have to be reliable, which means like when you're driving like 60, 70 miles an hour on the highway, it's not just like when your cell phone crashes that you just like, will restart it. It has to work like at -30, it has to work at +60. It has to be like, +60, I was thinking in Celsius. So like, it's, and yeah, it will be nothing. Otherwise, in Michigan, we can do it. But in any case, like, yeah, 120. Yeah, that was my reference. So it has to work at all those times. And the microchip crisis that we have at this point is because we use in automotive microchips that are like automotive grade, which means that they've been used again and again and again and again. They're reliable, but they're old generation compared to what you have in your phone. So upgrading, pushing to new capabilities is like always possible, but always to the risk that we sell your car back 6 months down the road because you left it like 2 nights in the cold or under the rain, something doesn't work anymore. And that's one of the challenges is how far can we push the limit, but still guarantee that your car will be reliable for the next 10 years to come. So that's a challenge, and hardware is always the pain point. Software upgrade, it's always possible, at least to give the feel to people that the upgrade happen. But the hardware is very difficult and expensive.
So let's thank them. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I want to take a moment to acknowledge our online folks. So we have some high school students who are joining us from the school at Mary Grove, which is a partnership with the University of Michigan with the Mary Grove Conservancy, excuse me. And this school is a high school that is focused on the engineering design process, social justice and engineering. It's a really innovative approach, and we're trying to develop a relationship with them. So if it's possible, I would love if they can share their screen so we can see them in the classroom, at least so our guests can see them. But I just want to acknowledge you all. I think you can see me best. I'm waving at you all. They're 9th graders. So if you all can give them a big hello, that'd be great.
Hello.
So, oh yeah, we see them, they're waving. Awesome. Awesome, they're waving. And so I just want to make sure we know that they were here. We hope to bring them on campus for this tour in the future. Oh, we just turned off the screen. Oh. should.
They turn their cameras off already.
Oh, okay. Can you hit that like button again?
It's already on, sorry.
Oh, okay.
You didn't hit it the first one.
Oh, put it back on so you could see your slides.
Is it,
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
there it is.
So I just wanted to make sure to acknowledge this next generation of designers who are already engaged in the design process at the high school level. So didn't want to forget them. So our final speaker for today is Chanel Beebe. I have the pleasure of introducing her because we've known each other or known of each other for a long time. And we got to finally kind of engage and interact in graduate school.
There it is.
Sweet. All right, so she's Chanel was born and raised in Detroit, Michigan. She's a creative artist, writer, educator, and who designs, implements, and conducts research in STEAM. For those who don't know, that's science, technology, engineering, the arts, and mathematics. And she looks specifically at programming. She conducts projects that investigate how non-engineers at various STEAM programming sites make sense of that experience. And she looks for the ways that they exhibit evidence of systems thinking. You're going to see and hear pieces of that in her talk. Chanel has a strong passion for nourishing the critical and social consciousness of youth and is the founder and CEO of a research and design firm that focuses on social and educational equity called Beebe Arts LLC. Within that role, she provides consulting, research, and various forms of media design to individuals, community groups, institutions, and corporations. And this year, she will graduate with her master's in industrial engineering and a PhD in engineering education from Purdue University. And she plans to continue to study socially situated design and learning experiences. I also want to add, as a growing social technical activist, Chanel seeks to blend her values of equity, health, and sustainability with her formal training as an industrial engineer. And you can find much more of her work at her website, chanelbeebe.com. So I'm really excited to have her on campus. And I'm really excited for you to share. And I think that along with the other two speakers, what you're going to share will resonate with our young people too. So thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chanel Beebe, like she said, and I'm super, super excited to be here. I want to say hello again to the people at Mary Grove. My very first art experience, my very
Just
first.
Be careful with this. I don't want you to.
I see it.
That's it.
My very first experience as a child, really doing something I really wanted to do, was actually at an art program at Mary Grove College. So shout out to y'all for being so amazing. And then shout out to University of Michigan Dearborn. My first engineering experience in high school was a part of a program called DAPSAP. And as a part of that program, we got to come on engineering campuses and do cool stuff. And the first campus I ever did anything like an engineer on was the University of Michigan Dearborn. So it's really full circle to be here. Like she mentioned, I am born and raised in Detroit, and I have a lot that I would like to share with you all today. And I won't be able to share all of it with you, but I'm gonna try to get to the point of what are we really doing for the people who matter? So my topic is, but what does this mean to the people who matter? What human-centered design, systems thinking can teach us about the way that we prioritize the vulnerable, right? Specifically, there's an ever-evolving journey of prioritizing the vulnerable. Like you just heard in those first two presentations, design is iterative, right? So there's a life cycle of your product, but there's also the life cycle of your engagement with your client. That also is an experience of your client, right? So those are some of the things that I've been thinking about. Let's see, otherwise.
I'm in touch.
That works. No, I got it. It's okay. All right. So this is my agenda for the day. I'm first going to introduce myself a little bit better. Then I'm going to talk about people who matter and how we figure out who those are. Then a little bit on human-centered design, because you all have just had an amazing crash course in human-centered design. And then I'm going to talk about what this evolving journey is, or at least what I think it is, right? So I think it involves defining needs, trying to understand the way people think, and then understand the way people are, the way they exist, right? And hopefully you'll have some takeaways. If not, you'll let me know, okay? So just so you know, I talk really fast, and that is not because I'm nervous. That is not anything I can control. So if you need to slow me down, raise your hand, right? Also, it's gonna be recorded. So if I go over something too quickly and you weren't able to process it, go back and watch the recording and then still ask me whatever question happened there, okay? All of these things are also evolving. Like she said, I'm still a student. I'm still figuring these things out. So if you have any feedback, conversations, papers, projects, please send those my way. So as I'm talking through stuff, I want all the unsolicited advice and opinions you have, okay? I know that's a wild thing to ask, but I'm finishing my dissertation, so this is the time. All right. So this is me, which is kind of redundant because you can see me, but I am an artist, a writer, entrepreneur, educator, and a researcher, in addition to being an engineer. And I think it's important to start and ground this conversation in the fact that I was a whole person before I became an engineer, and I keep being a whole person while being an engineer. I have a few little things you probably should know. So Detroit is really important. I also have a really strong background in engineering. So I tend to be really logical sometimes, but you saw the artist and the writer, right? Yeah, I can imagine this is a rough experience. We're not going to talk about all this today. In fact, we're really only going to focus on that researcher part, but a lot of these other pieces are going to come up. So I wanted to say them explicitly, right? You can feel free to ask questions about those. So as we think about who matters, any of us who do anything, we do it for a reason, right? We do it either to make people's lives better, to make our lives better, to make money, to accomplish some new big thing. But as we do that, we don't really know which buttons to push first, right? So if I really want to affect climate change, should I start at the local level, or should I go straight to the UN, or should I just recycle, right? Like which way, where do we go? As we figure that stuff out, designers and engineers usually have really good intentions, right? So sometimes we know that we want to have good impact, and we know what bad impact looks like, right? We know success is somewhere far from us, and right now is unacceptable, right? We also know we have some intentions, right? So we don't intend harm. We intend that whatever we do means that you're better after I've done it, not worse, right? But that doesn't always work out like that, right? Our intent with that project don't always align with the things that we're trying to do. Ideally, we want things that are up in this category that are doing good impact, and we intended that. A lot of times that happens and we do really cool things. Sometimes the intent was not real, right? I didn't really intend anything, but something good happened. Post-it notes, right? We stumbled upon something and that was great. That was awesome. Other times something terrible happened, but something good still came out of it. If you can classify mold as terrible, right? Penicillin came out of just observing something decaying, which up until that point didn't really have much meaning or value, but became really valuable. My concern is everything on the other side of this. What happens when our intent is bad and we have bad impact? We know that, right? That's not the goal. But up here is really where engineers fall. And it's like, I intended something good, and then something really weird happened. It's actually worse. And we're on the news now. And now we have to pay, like things get really bad. This image is an example of a project where the intent was good. The intent was to create a water pumping system in which the children would play on this merry-go-round, and that would pump water out the ground, and the people could just get it from a faucet, which should have been better than what they were doing before, which was manually having to push the faucet up and down. So now kids are doing the work, and adults can just come get water. What actually happened was that the kids did not play. So adults had to go spin this merry-go-round every time they wanted to get water, which was significantly worse, right? So the intent was good, but it did not work out very well. And this is a problem, right? The people who matter, they matter. Their experiences matter. We have all our processes, but somehow stuff turns out really weirdly. There's a lot of different ways you can address that, right? So we just talked about a lot of different processes for human-centered design. There's a lot of different ways you could problem solve it, right? You can go from the problem, you can go from the source of the problem or the symptom. My company that I currently work with, they use human-centered design in an approach that's kind of iterative. So the goal is to walk through all these stages with the partner as often as possible. But that doesn't necessarily guarantee that things are going to work out, right? No matter how good the visual gets, the actual meeting still has to happen, right? The actual conversation still has to happen. So as I'm thinking about these things, what I'm realizing is there's this process that the designer themselves has to be engaged in. The designer themselves has to be aware that there's this meta process that's happening on top of all these other processes. And I think that that process is something I'm calling the evolving journey of prioritizing the vulnerable. When we start projects, it's because we have a concept of the vulnerable. We have a concept of who it matters to. We usually have some concept of that person's needs and that person's experiences, but as we get through the project, that expands. Like the question that was asked earlier, sometimes we do a whole project and realize that the actual goal was not really a good goal. We did it, but that wasn't the problem. We built the playground, but crime is still where it is. We changed the curriculum, but we still don't have Black and brown students. So there's something else that's happening, right? If the designers, if the researchers, if the engineers, if the educators are not aware of this meta process, the micro process gets real painful, right? And I think there's these things that we can be thinking about along the way that can allow us to keep in touch with that meta process. Thank you for the slowdown. We're gonna get into these more specifically, but instead of just talking in theory about these, I wanted to give examples from projects that I've done. There's not enough time to really talk about these projects for real. So what I'm gonna try to do is give you a high level of the findings and a little bit of the methods, because I think that would be useful for some of the students who are kind of on this journey, but really keep this framework in mind, right? So what are we surfacing? In my field, we look at engineering engagement programs. So because I come up in engineering, the first time that I was really smacked in the face with the idea of a stakeholder was when I was in my first engineering capstone class, and they were like, you're gonna do a service learning program. And you have to go find the needs of this community partner and make solutions for them, right? There are a lot of projects that look like this. Human-centered design is an approach that can happen in some of those projects, but in engineering engagement programs, we currently don't really know much about what these experiences are. So one of the first projects that I was put on was actually looking at the experiences of African-American engineers at a predominantly white institution. And they handed me some research questions, and the assumption was that answering these research questions would affect change in some type of situation. So the major question was, how do they perceive and experience engineering, and what strategies do they use to cope? The ideal being, if we figure out how they're surviving and help them survive, it'll be okay. However, because I happen to be a part of this group, right, because I am a Black person at a predominantly white institution, I knew that that experience was not just a design spec. It wasn't just the current state of the ecosystem. It actually was an experience of trauma, right? So to start asking questions about your experience, I have to ask you about your experience of being marginalized. There are a lot of frameworks that already exist to talk about the experience of being marginalized. The button stopped working, there we go. But my favorite one is this one that uses storytelling. And it actually evolved out of some psychological help for African-American women who had been a part of traumatic relationships and how they described the way they got out of it. And what they found was that people didn't jump to the trauma. They actually first started telling the story of the context. So they first started talking about what they expected the situation to be like, what the situation meant to them. And then they talk about what had happened before, right? So either my grandmother, my uncle, or my brother, or somebody else. And then they say, okay, well, this is what actually happened, right? This is what I didn't like. So everything in the middle is what I was really trying to situate to answer these research questions. Because I knew that these people were vulnerable, because I knew that these people were marginalized, I wanted to make sure that they had a whole experience, not just one interview where I asked them, how do you cope? Understood? So as I'm trying to define these needs, I had to come up with a research design that allowed me to actually build relationships so that we could talk about those things, but also allowed them to walk away from the experience not feeling more traumatized. So instead of just doing one interview or one survey, I did a 3-step approach where I started with a focus group where we just kind of talked about what we expected before we got here, right? So what did you think college was going to be like? What has it been like? We got into the thick of it a little bit, but not much, right? These are really low stakes environments where there are multiple people talking, so you don't necessarily have to like get really vulnerable, right? You can say, oh, a friend of mine had this experience. So that was the first phase. The second phase was one-on-one interviews where we actually got to get into it a little bit more. So by that point, they talked to me a few times, there've been a few rounds of emails, and now I can ask more probing questions about what happens in the classroom, what happens in your group experiences, what happens in your emails. Technically, at that point, I had enough information to answer my research question, right? Because that tells me what they're going through and how they're coping. But at that point, where my user is, they just talked about something real traumatic. If that's the end of the project, if that's the end of the engagement, what happens the next time they see something from that project? They go back to the last engagement they had, which was a very traumatic one. So instead of ending the project there, I added this third phase where they got to tell us more. So beyond what has happened, beyond what you expected, what would you actually like to see? I know that's not a part of this project, right? But let's talk about it. Let's give you some moments to think about that. The interesting thing is that most of my answers to the research question ended up coming out of this third phase. These first 2 phases told me a little bit, but nothing that the research didn't already tell us. This third phase, they had problems. As I asked them to imagine a university they would want to come back to, why would I come back here? What would you like to see come out of this project? Less emails Right, so that tells me that they actually want something really different than what these research questions are asking about, right? And I was able to report back and define needs in a way completely outside of the scope of the project, but it actually led to a whole nother round of stuff that the university is still dealing with, right? Which is a little bit different than what they expected, but allowed me to define needs and surface that meta process. Okay. So as I was going through that, the major part was to focus on the user experience. Oftentimes when we think about user experiences as designers, we think about end users, not necessarily about the person that are in the prototyping sessions or the person that's reading the email when you're asking about things, right? User experience is not just a matter of your immediate stakeholder, but all the stakeholders involved. How does that email come off? What's the tone of that email? What's the first time that they've seen, right? One thing I didn't mention in this program was that I made sure that before the research even started, I had like a tour of information sessions at African-American student group organizations where I just talked about the project. Didn't ask for nothing, gave them pizza, hey, you know, so that's a different type of user experience. The context and history, right? I had to think about what is their experience now, but also what has their experience been in prior diversity and inclusion things and prior emails about this. They've been taxed, right? They've been drained, something has happened. I can't just treat them like they are really here to work with me. And then lastly, that way, grounding participation. Participation beyond just the one interview that you want from them, right? So asking them, how would you like this research to be used? These are the questions I have today. Any other questions you think I should ask? This is what, hey, I have a presentation coming up next week. This is the slide deck that I'm thinking about sharing. Do these findings make sense to you? Which is member checking, right? We know that from a research standpoint, but how much do we do that in our actual work? As we do that, we realize that these people have different ways of thinking, right? And for me, as an industrial engineer, one of the ways of thinking that I always have been fascinated by is systems thinking. Because if you could think in systems, in theory, you should be able to change the world in a couple of thoughts, right? System thinking is very useful for complex problems. It pretty much requires that you have a problem that is important, a problem that is not a one-time event, a problem that has some history that you can go look up, and lastly, a problem that people have failed at solving before. Can anybody think of some complex problems?
Climate change.
Oh. I mean, you're all looking at me wearing masks. I think that's a problem, right? this wasn't how this used to be. So there's a lot of different ways that system thinking can be used. There's a lot of different problems for it. However, system thinking right now is a thing of the academy, right? Unless you are an industrial engineer or somebody who really has a reason, you're not really describing what you're doing in systems thinking. I'm not necessarily saying that that's necessary. However, it might be useful, right? To know other words and other ways to describe what you're doing. It also might be useful for us as engineers if we had a way of understanding how other people were thinking, right? Not just how they answer our question and what they said the spec would be, but what type of thinking are they engaging in, right? So if I'm developing metrics on their experience, what should my criteria even be, right? How do I know what success really looks like? Not getting too deeply into the weeds of it, but system thinking is something that has been pretty well understood in terms of components and factors that can be broken down to understanding students, right? So engineers and designers are really interested in how we teach system thinking because we want designers to do it, but we haven't really looked at how our clients do it, how our stakeholders do it. And that's what I did in my master's thesis, even though it came up weird. My research question was, what evidence of systems thinking do community partners exhibit in their engineering engagement programs? So I'm going into places where engineering students are working with communities, and I'm asking the community partners, the non-engineer, what is this experience like? What do you understand about this experience? What were you expecting? What was your first conversation with that student like? And then I'm looking for what evidence of system thinking existed in that. These are some of the interview questions. I put this up here to say that in order to really engage with people and what matters to those people, you have to engage over time, right? And a lot of times, especially as designers, you want to design a really good survey or one really good focus group. You need to iterate as much as you can. So I have to kind of build up to understanding and getting to hear what their conversation was. So I had 3 different rounds of interview with them. Some at the beginning, one at the beginning, one in the middle, and one towards the end. But like you saw on the last slide, some of the projects and people that I talked to were engaged in longer projects or shorter projects. So beginning, middle, and end means different things, obviously. But it is important to collect data throughout. So as I did that research, okay, this is how things are showing up today. What I found is that these community partners actually exhibited a lot of systems thinking, like a lot, even in the classes that weren't about systems thinking. So maybe they were capable of doing it the whole time. maybe we should ask them questions like they're capable of thinking like that, right? That's essentially the conclusion of my thesis. Essentially, they are capable of doing systems thinking. However, we haven't really asked, right? And we haven't even really thought about the way that they're engaging and experiencing these settings. We do a little bit of evaluation, but really for the sake of proving that the students learned something, or that the students did something, not necessarily to speak to the experience being improved of the community partner. So when we think about ways of thinking, your positionality matters, right? So if I want to understand how you think, I first need to understand the way that I think, right? I need to make explicit things that would normally be implicit. So for me as an engineer, that meant I need to go understand systems thinking first. What is the language I'm already speaking? So then I can figure out if I can speak that language with other people. Next, I have to be intentional about that. Once I know who I am, which I know the power that I hold, I need to have conversations aware of that. I need to make sure that I'm making space, that I'm sharing power, that I'm sharing capacity, that I'm giving people options, right? And being intentional about the way that I leverage what I know my way of thinking is, because we know that that will affect the way that things can cross context. And that is the ultimate goal, I think, of a lot of designer work, right? Usually we're trying to do something so that it can be used again, or so that it can be applied to a different context. That's the goal of the design project, but how much do we do that in our actual engagement with the community partners, in our actual engagement with our stakeholders? Are we thinking about how this might look and feel if this wasn't a research project, right? If this was just a collaboration, if this was just a partnership, would you send that email the same way? Would you do it first and then send it to them, or would you ask for feedback first? And then, like, think about changing the context through which you're engaging with people, right? And that's the ways of thinking piece that's obviously evolving. And lastly, in my dissertation, I started thinking about ways of being. So what meaning are they making of these spaces? I know I can kind of describe how they thought. I can say that they had X amount of systems thinking evidence from my master's thesis, but I don't really know what those experiences meant to them. So in my dissertation, I looked at those same community partners and I asked, what meaning do they make of their experience? And that's a really hard question to answer, right? Because what is meaning? But as I got into it, I was able to pull from, I think this is the distance of the, okay, we got it now. Pushing the wrong button. I was able to get into the research and see what do we currently know about the experiences of community partners. And the unfortunate truth is that usually when we talk about the community partner in these settings, we assume that they are the same as the community organization. So this model I show here is one of the most recent models of community engagement experiences and all the relationships that can surface in those. Where do you imagine the community partner might go? What might their experience be there? All right, they're bouncing all over trying to make it work. So to me, this is a problem. And what I was hoping to do with my dissertation is to really figure out what might the experience of a community partner be, and what might that mean for the way that they're engaging in the space. Meaning making in and of itself is really nebulous, but it's actually been described as one of the first steps to learning, right? And typically when we think about learning, we're not really trying to address the learning of community partners or random adults on the street. It's usually for students. But if we use that mindset, right, that way of thinking to answer this research question, then I would need a theoretical framework that'll allow me to understand learning in some way. What I was able to find is that there's actually a framework for meaning making that was based on different learning theories by Dewey and Berner. Yeah, that's right. And pretty much what this theory, what this framework says is that meaning can surface in 3 different ways. These ways are not mutually exclusive. However, there are different buckets through which you can understand how people are making meaning. Some meaning is existential, so it's a larger life journey. Some meaning is pragmatic, so it's about doing something. And other meaning is semantic, so it's about language, meaning, ways of thinking. And I'm like, okay, well, that's interesting. Let's go see what type of meaning my community partners are making. So I took the quotes, mapped them onto the framework, and these are the meanings that I found. I'll give you a second to read them. Anything jumping out at anyone? This is not a trick question.
I just think it's interesting that you're giving like a personality to the community partner. So they're not just the organization or the person that you call when you need to make something happen, but they have thoughts on the engagement with students
Mhm.
in general, they're not just a tool, but they actually have some value and thoughts.
Yeah, yeah. And they have a really different experience with everybody else, right? They have this kind of insider, outsider. They're not students, they're not faculty. Yeah, there's this connection around happening. What I thought was interesting was the last bullet point, which is that they have relationships and conceptions of internal stakeholders. Internal stakeholders I obviously have not defined, but when we think about the ecosystem of these settings, usually there's a student and the community partner is seen as a stakeholder, right? Or sometimes the community partner is the connection to other stakeholders. But our community partners are talking about internal stakeholders. Who's that? Shouldn't it be you, right? Who's that person? What I found is that the community partners are actually doing a lot of negotiation across the students and the ecosystem of their organization, right? So one of the findings I think is around the fact that the community partners are usually part of an organization that has influence on the problem space, but not direct influence, but still has control, right? So the community partner has to do that kind of negotiation. One obvious finding from these results is that there's not a lot of existential meeting happening, right, which is to be expected. The semantic meeting is all mostly related to communication, which is to be expected because community partners do a lot of this in their settings. But there's another reason why I think that a lot of these results were pragmatic. And I think that was pragmatic mostly because of the way I asked the question, right? What was my question? What meaning do community partners make in engineering engagement programs? What happened as I started analyzing data is that I couldn't analyze interesting stuff because it wasn't happening in the engineering engagement. It happened 2 years ago in the meeting, before the community partners were ever a part of the program. So when I tried to code it to answer my research question, technically, this doesn't exist, right? This didn't happen. So yes, they do make pragmatic meaning, but they make that meaning through their previous experiences, through their relationships, right? And that has some implications for maybe the way that we think about meaning, right? Because I wasn't able to get to a lot of existential stuff because of the limitations of my framework, right? My framework kind of boxed everything off at related to the project, related to the student. And that makes sense because as a researcher, I'm really trying to figure that out. But if I think about that evolving journey of prioritizing the vulnerable, then there's a meta process that I'm missing. There's a whole engagement experience that the community partner is going through, and possibly might need to expand the way that we conceive of those settings. The day after I presented this a month ago, somebody made a really interesting framework for community partners and engineering engagement settings. I do suggest you go read it. It still very much prioritizes the engineering engagement setting, but it does have a little bit of that internal stakeholder, right? That idea that there are more people happening, right? So as much as this is not happening, we're getting there, right? We're starting to see it. So I don't want to say that like, nobody's doing this, it's happening. It also happens to be happening at Purdue as well. So I guess that's a plug for my institution. But it's happening everywhere. Just for the sake of time, I'm gonna put to kind of the so what. As we're doing these things, we need to think about how we prioritize their experiences and their interactions, right? In the way that we answer our questions, in the way that we choose our method, in the way that we choose our questions for those specific interview sessions. That I've already talked about. So when we think about ways of being, a lot of things comes up, right? So there's meaning in learning in the first place, which is a very existential thing to try to grapple with, but you do have engineering education researchers if you need us to help with that. But we do know basic things about learning, right? We know that it happens over time. We know that it's something that has to happen engagingly. And if we think about that at the whole time as we're designing, that means that we need to be thinking about the learning objectives of literally everything we're doing, right? What am I communicating to my partners, to my participants, as I send this email, as I create this setting, as I send this flyer, what are the implications? What is the meaning of what I'm really trying to do, right? Next, boundaries and relationships. What have I scoped? What have I decided was important? What have I decided was the directionality of that importance, right? Who has control in those relationships? And lastly, what are the experiences and rituals? That one is an evolving one, but what I've realized is that there are certain expectations associated with how design work should happen, with how engineers or designers should be engaged with. And those expectations need to be grounded and made explicit. Otherwise, they will just kind of silently guide the way that things go, right? So my community partners who have been involved in programs for years, they were just like, oh, I never thought to do that because I never had to. I guess I could just tell them that though, like now that you mentioned it, that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? But if we're not thinking about it, what implication is that having on her experience? What implication is that having on the types of solutions the students are able to design for her in that experience if she's not completely bringing her whole self to it because The ritual says she shouldn't. The ritual says she just has to show up and say yes or no, right? Another layer of this as well is the ritual of how much people really want to get out these settings. Because as much as we can be as inclusive as we want to, some community partners really just want to come and go. They really just want it to be more like a consulting experience, right? I think that gets tied into the rituals in terms of what suggestions or what solutions do we suggest to these community partners? Are we always sending them to the same capstone programs? Or are we ever sending them grant opportunities or partnership opportunities, right? Because a lot of times the reasons that people have their expectations is because of what they've seen before, right? They've never been partnered with before. So in their head, the best you can do for them is consult with them. You start talking about engagement and that just sounds like more conversations. They have to see the value of it, right? So wrapping up here, I think the so what for me is that the professional is the personal. So as we are developing ourselves as designers, ourselves as scholars, as students, or whatever we are, there is a person that is developing that identity. And that person has a lot of conceptions and experiences that will impact the work that we do, right? So my output as an engineer is affected by what my experiences have been. And that means that I have a form of power, right? There's a way in which I can use my experiences and my knowing to set space, to create energy, and maybe even to name something and call something something else, right? And that's when you really start to see some change for the things you care about. And for me, in order to be able to like do this work in a way that mattered, I think about who are the people I care about, right? I care about my grandmother, I care about my little brother, I care about people that normally in these settings, you don't really ask about them. You don't look for them, they're often just given things, not really asked about what they need. And if that's what I care about, then I start thinking about the hierarchy of needs, like he was just talking about, right? And another framework for hierarchy of needs is really beyond the idea of self-fulfillment, but this idea of cultural perpetuity, right? If my goal is not just to solve this one problem, to make more money, but my goal is really to see my culture survive, then I gotta get really good at defining needs. I gotta get really good at thinking about how people are showing up. What are people thinking? What do people even think the goal is, right? Do we all want to survive forever together? Maybe some of us want to go live in a forest by ourselves quietly, you know, like that's a different design process. And for me, as we do that, I think a lot about what the collaboration of it needs to feel like, right? So this is a piece of artwork that I created. On it, it says, if I eat, you eat, and if we eat, we build, right? So the goal is not necessarily just to meet needs. The goal is to meet needs to continue evolving through the process with people, right? And if that's the case, then the quality of my relationship, the quality of every piece of that experience matters because we're building after this. We're not just eating and leaving. I think that the evolving journey has to start with yourself. So these are some research questions, some reflection questions that I've used to kind of stop and think throughout my process as to what I'm trying to do, right? This is an evolving kind of ask. You know, you can't answer all these questions once and be done with it. But for me, regularly thinking about what am I caring about? Why am I upset about this email right now? Is there something about the client or something about the person? What is the thing that I'm prioritizing? And then what changes would I like to see? Do I have access to resources associated with that? Or do I need partners? And then who can I connect to? Right, so a lot of my goal with this framework of this evolving journey of prioritizing the vulnerable is really to first realize that the first vulnerable person that you have in your design projects is you. Your ideas are vulnerable, your experiences are vulnerable, but also you're capable of marginalizing, you're capable of excluding, you're capable of not quite doing your job. That's a vulnerability, right? That's a vulnerability. And if you would like to avoid that, I think reflection is really the answer, but it has to be collaborative reflection, right? It can't just be silent by yourself, which is why that last part is really important, right? Don't just think about who you are and be like, oh, that's who I am now for sure. Don't ask me to do anything else. So this is the framework once again, and that's the end. If you have any questions, feedback, I'm open to it.
Thank you very much. I just want to point out that your presentation, maybe it's not yet making sense to our students, but it makes a lot of sense to us who developed the program, because we envision the program to be a program that can be part of this community partners and complement them, and your experience and your science about it will be very helpful for us in the future. So if you have any questions, please go ahead. Take advantage of Dr. to be Beebe with us and ask all the questions you want.
Just for transparency, that was very scary. I'm glad it's over.
So in the last, in one of the last slides about the reflection questions, I noticed that a lot of them seem very empowering and positive and not really asking about like any of the some pain points, you know, they're asking more about like, okay, what do you care about? What do you value? And then how do you strive for it? Was there anything in your research that showed you that like focusing on the positive instead of dwelling on the negatives is better or worse, or you know, or was there no difference between them?
So those reflection questions are more of a function of my experience across those research studies than the actual implication of them. So I don't think that there's any strong voice in my research that says whether they should be positive or negative. I think my research just says that it needs to be often, it needs to be continuous. I think the reason why I started those positively is I think because, especially for designers and engineers, because we like to problem solve and because we like to reverse engineer and work backwards, a lot of assumptions are made in identifying problems, right? But if you start from what would you like to see, what would the good thing be? Then as you reverse engineer from there, it almost gets bigger instead of smaller, right? Because now you're starting from a place of blue sky, and then how to make blue sky happen, as opposed to it rains sometime over here sometimes. Let me fix that situation. And I think for the nature of kind of prioritizing the vulnerable, it almost needs to start positively because you're only engaging because the negative exists, right? So to probe in it even more at the onset, oftentimes I think would create even more fatigue to even make it through the process, right? But I think if you start with like, yes, I know things are terrible, but what would I like to see, right? So in the example with the students that I did, like in those focus groups, we talked about like what they expected college to be like, but also we talked about like what would be an ideal situation, right? Like what would be the best that this could be. And that for some reason gave us a lot of pain points, right? It showed us a lot more pain points than it would have had I started with what are your pain points. So I think there's some value in it, but I can't necessarily scientifically prove that. Just yet, give me a couple years, I guess. Yeah.
So community is a very large concept. Can you talk about in the study that you're doing, what is that definition of community? And it's physical being, is that a school or?
I think within the context of engineering engagement programs, community is usually defined as an organization that has created some existing relationship with a geographic location. And that organization is able to be a representative into the university space. But in the research community is a little bit deeper than just people who are very tangibly tied to the program. Community is kind of that evolving network of stakeholders, right? And how big that gets. I think the major limitation that I'm finding in my study is that engineering engagement programs don't really bother to define community. And when they do, they start at the stakeholder they're closest to and define everything around that one, which does make sense in terms of efficient problem solving, but doesn't make sense for the larger problem ecosystem that you can't really get to if you don't define community a little bit broadly at the beginning.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? I don't know if I can answer your question.
Yeah, because I see it as a huge challenge.
Yeah.
Like exactly what you said. They access whoever is interested in not the general community that you want to push the idea. Thank you.
I just want to comment, just thank you, because I think what you gave is a good example of a deep dive into kind of the problem scoping stage of really understanding who you're working with and how, especially like I work with first year engineers, so often they think they know because they've done a quick internet search or they made a quick phone call, that they've done enough to know what the needs are. And I think what you're showing us here is that it's not quick.
Yeah, it can't.
And you never really fully know them. And so it's kind of an ongoing process of continuing to know who you're working with and how you can work together. So I just want to thank you.
Yeah, I think often usually the resistance to that is that because it takes time and usually these projects are on very fixed timeline, people are like, we don't have time for that, right? I think what I'm suggesting is if we're going to rush to do it in a mindful way, that we're taking notes of what we're making assumptions about the whole time. So for that first project, I gave an example of I was chosen to be the RA for that project because they had seen I had experience advocating for African-American students on campus. So in their head, I am the person to design the study. I could have just taken that and been like, oh, yeah, let me make a survey of the specific questions I think should happen. But instead I reflected and was like, wait a minute. Just because I was a Black student on the college campus before doesn't mean that I know everything about this. I should actually just build a relationship with them like I don't know them, knowing that I do know them. So I know where they hang out. Let me just go there and see what they say. I know what they like to talk about, so let me make a couple questions around that. You know, so there's a way to, I think, lean into the assumptions, into the efficiency that the process calls for, but also doing it in a way that leave space for some of those unintended consequences of either the social distance between you and your stakeholder, or of the nature of the process, right? And the fact that you can't really know what you're solving for until somebody tells you actually over here. I saw a hand.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, like, I really like how you talk about the reflect on the purpose of like how you, who do you care about, like, but what changed, like, what changed with you made you think like who the person that you care about will do. So like my family, my dad, like how would they use like the new technology, how would we make it more similar in my community?
And how would you describe it to the people you care about, right? Because oftentimes, usually these projects come with report outs that require you to use language that don't really help people understand it, right? They just make it sound expensive. But one of the things I push my students to do, because I do a lot of like rapid prototyping around social problems with students. And what we do when it's time to make the problem is I force them to say, who are you solving for and what are you trying to make better? And then every time we're doing anything, they have that problem statement. Yeah, because otherwise the idea just gets really exciting, right? And then you start coming up with features, you start having ideas, you start being like, okay, solve this problem too, we can do this, we can do that, we can do that. But if you ground it in like, no, who's this for? You know, and then after a while, what's interesting is that who is it for question won't be enough, and you have to get even more specific. You know, so it might at first be for just to improve the lives of these people. And now, well, all of these solutions, all these possible next steps will improve the lives. Who specifically do you want to prioritize right now then? I want to prioritize, and I think that was the slide that showed up weirdly. All of the engineering students that I had, right, I was like, well, yes, technically I can focus on, I think the project came out of mechanical engineering, and they wanted me to focus on the experience of mechanical engineering. I'm like, we have all these students. I think I could focus on all of them and then get a little bit more deeper into mechanical engineering. But if I stay at mechanical engineering, that means I have to focus on 3 students and have them speak to the whole experience of African American students, right? So sometimes there's iteration in the iteration, right? There's that double layer thing. I think I've made that point. Thank y'all so much for this. Any last questions?
All right. Thank you very much. I really want to thank all our speakers. I mean, at least for me, their insights were very valuable. I hope they will serve our students as it should be. So the presentation will be recorded and I'll be posting them on our website, the ACED websites, if anyone else wants to review them. So we will carry on with our schedule. So the next step is the campus tour, and specifically we will be touring HCED facilities. We will start with the facilities we have on CASL, because the program that we developed is a multidisciplinary program that involves CASL, involves CUB, and involves engineering. So my colleague Sarah Nesbitt will be the first one to give you the tour in the CASL. I'll have to take care of a few things here, and I will meet you at IAVS. And we will continue our tour. So thank you very much.
Thank you. If I can also do a plug, stay around to the class, come back for the tea hour. We have the delicious